There's a profound shift that occurs when a woman looks at a man and simply says no, not aggressively, not apologetically, just clearly and firmly. No. This single word carries immense psychological weight in human relationships. Carl Jung, one of the founding fathers of analytical psychology, understood that true respect emerges when we acknowledge the boundaries between ourselves and others. The ability to set boundaries, to say no, is not just a communication skill, it's a fundamental aspect of psychological individuation. Think about the last time someone respected your boundaries. How did it feel? There's something deeply validating about having your limits acknowledged. Now consider the opposite. When your boundaries were ignored or dismissed, that violation creates a psychological wound that can fester beneath the surface of relationships. In American culture, we often glorify the yes person, always available, always agreeable. Women especially face this expectation, with centuries of conditioning to be accommodating, nurturing, and self-sacrificing. Yet Jung's work reveals something counterintuitive. Healthy relationships require differentiation between individuals, not mere agreeableness. When a woman says no, she declares her psychological sovereignty. She communicates, "I exist separately from your desires. I have my own inner compass." This isn't about rejection, it's about authenticity. A recent study from the University of Michigan found that women who consistently set clear boundaries in relationships reported 40% higher satisfaction in those relationships. Men in the study described feeling greater respect for partners who communicated limits clearly. This empirical evidence supports what Jung intuited through his analytical work. Psychological wholeness requires honoring the boundaries between self and other. Consider Sarah, a marketing executive in Chicago. For years, she prided herself on being available to everyone, clients, colleagues, family, at all hours. "I thought being indispensable made me valuable," she reflected, "but I was exhausted, resentful, and paradoxically, not truly respected." When she began setting boundaries, declining after-hours client calls, saying no to projects outside her scope, something unexpected happened. People started treating me differently. My boss began consulting me on strategic decisions. My partner became more attentive. It was like they finally saw me as a whole person. Jung would recognize this transformation as part of the individuation process, the journey toward becoming a psychologically complete individual. The shadow aspect of boundarylessness, the resentment, the exhaustion, the loss of self, needed integration through the power of no. What makes this word so powerful in male-female dynamics specifically? Jung's concept of the anima and animus offers insight. Men project their anima, their inner feminine aspect, onto women in their lives. When a woman embodies boundarylessness, she becomes a vessel for unlimited projection. But when she says no, she disrupts this projection. She forces recognition of her separateness, her reality beyond the projection. This creates the necessary psychological tension from which genuine respect can emerge. Have you ever noticed how people who say yes to everything often receive less respect over time? This psychological paradox reveals something important about human nature. We value what maintains its integrity, what isn't infinitely available. By saying no, a woman demonstrates self-value, and others unconsciously calibrate their behavior to match this valuation. The word no acts as a mirror, reflecting back to men their own relationship with limits. How a man responds to this boundary reveals his psychological development. Does he respect it or attempt to override it? Does he value the woman more for her self-containment, or does he seek someone more permeable to his influence? For women navigating relationships, this understanding offers liberation from the belief that constant accommodation leads to being valued. Jung's work suggests the opposite, that the capacity to delineate one's psychological territory is essential for mutual respect. When a woman says no, she doesn't just establish a boundary, she initiates a profound psychological process that Jung would recognize as shadow work. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, contains those parts of ourselves we've rejected, denied, or never developed. For many men, rejection triggers shadow material, feelings of inadequacy, memories of past rejections, or unconscious beliefs about entitlement to female attention. This is where the transformation begins. Consider what happens beneath the surface. When a boundary is set, the initial response might be disappointment or even anger, primitive emotional reactions that emerge from the ego's thwarted desires. But in psychologically mature men, something else follows. a recognition of the other person's sovereignty, and with it, a deepening respect. James, a software developer from Boston, described this process. When I first started dating my now wife, she turned down my invitation to come over late one night. I was frustrated in the moment, but driving home I had this strange realization. I respected her more for it. She wasn't just accommodating my wants. She had her own internal compass. What James experienced was the dissolution of projection and the beginning of seeing his partner as a complete individual with her own psychological integrity. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. When a woman says no, she creates the necessary friction for this alchemical process. Without this friction, without the capacity for refusal, relationships remain psychologically shallow, based more on projection than authentic connection. American culture. We often confuse agreeableness with connection. Television shows, movies, and advertisements have historically portrayed women's value as tied to their availability and accommodation. But Jung's understanding of the individuated personality suggests something different, that true intimacy can only exist between two psychologically whole individuals who recognize and respect each other's boundaries. Research from the Gottman Institute, which has studied thousands of couples over decades, supports this view. Their data shows that relationships with clear boundaries and mutual respect for those boundaries show significantly higher longevity and satisfaction rates. Dr. John Gottman calls this accepting influence, the willingness to be affected by your partner's needs and boundaries, rather than trying to override them. The word no carries archetypal significance. In mythology across cultures, we see this pattern repeated. The hero or heroine must reject something, a temptation, a false path, to claim their true destiny. When a woman says no, she participates in this archetypal journey, claiming her psychological sovereignty. Men who understand this, even unconsciously, respond with respect rather than resentment. Think about the relationships in your life where respect flows naturally. Aren't they the ones where both people feel free to express their authentic needs? Where no is understood not as rejection of the person, but as honoring of the self. This dynamic plays out in professional contexts as well. Emma, an attorney in New York, found that her colleagues regularly interrupted her during meetings and assigned her administrative tasks despite her senior position. I started saying no clearly and directly, not apologetically, not with justification, just, no, I won't be taking notes for this meeting, or no, I need to finish my point before we move on. The shift was remarkable. Within weeks, the interruptions decreased and I was being consulted on strategic decisions more frequently. What Emma experienced reflects another Jungian concept. When we integrate aspects of our shadow, in this case perhaps the fear of disapproval or conflict, we reclaim psychological energy that was previously bound up in suppression. This integration radiates outward, changing how others perceive and respond to us. The respect that emerges when a woman says no is not superficial deference, but recognition of her as a complete psychological being. Jung believed that the ultimate goal of psychological development was wholeness, not perfection, but the integration of all aspects of the self, including the capacity to define and defend one's boundaries. For men navigating relationships with women, this understanding offers a pathway to deeper connection. Rather than seeing boundaries as obstacles to overcome, they can be recognized as invitations to engage at a more authentic level. The woman who says no is not rejecting connection, but rejecting the kind of connection that would diminish her selfhood. This perspective transforms the traditional narrative around male-female dynamics. Instead of the pursuit and acquiescence model that has dominated much of our cultural storytelling, we can envision relationships based on mutual recognition of each other's psychological complexity. Have you ever noticed how the relationships that last, the ones with enduring respect and affection, are those where both people maintain their distinct identities, where no is as respected as yes, respected as. This is not coincidence, but the natural outcome of psychological individuation playing out in relationship. Jung observed that the shoe that fits one person pinches another. In relationships, this means recognizing that what works for one person may not work for another. The woman who says no is honoring her unique psychological needs rather than conforming to external expectations. The respect this generates is not just social but deeply psychological, recognition of her as a distinct soul on her own journey. As we move through life's relationships, we might consider, are we saying no when necessary? Are we respecting others' right to do the same? These questions lead us toward greater psychological wholeness and toward relationships characterized by genuine respect rather than mere accommodation. The journey toward psychological wholeness, what Jung called individuation, is perhaps life's most profound undertaking. At its core lies a paradox. To truly connect with others, we must first become fully ourselves. The woman who has discovered the power of no stands at an important threshold of this journey. She has begun the process of differentiation that Jung saw as essential to psychological development. But what happens beyond this threshold? How does the capacity to set boundaries evolve into complete psychological individuation? And how does this transformation affect not just how men respect women, but how authentic relationships form between fully individuated beings? Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This becoming requires us to distinguish between our authentic self and the adaptive self we've constructed to meet external expectations. For many women, particularly in American society, these expectations have historically included excessive agreeableness, conflict avoidance, and prioritizing others' needs above their own. The simple word no represents a reclamation of the authentic self from these collective expectations. Consider the archetypal dimension of this boundary setting. In Jungian terms, archetypes are universal patterns or motifs that emerge from the collective unconscious. When a woman sets clear boundaries, she often activates the archetype of the sovereign, the ruler of her own psychological kingdom, who determines what may enter and what must remain outside. This archetype carries tremendous power and dignity, qualities that naturally evoke respect from others. Lisa, a teacher from Portland, described her experience. I grew up believing that being liked was more important than being respected. I'd say yes to additional commitments, tolerate disrespectful behavior, and silence my opinions if they might cause conflict. When I began therapy in my 30s, my therapist asked a question that changed everything. What would happen if you prioritized your self-respect over others' approval? That question led me to start saying no when things didn't feel right for me. The shift in how people, especially men, responded to me was immediate. Colleagues stopped dumping their work on me. Dates stopped pushing boundaries. My father, who had always dismissed my opinions, began asking what I thought. Lisa's experience illustrates what Jung observed about psychological projection. When we fail to set boundaries, we become perfect screens for others' projections. They see in us not who we are, but what they need us to be. The word no disrupts this projection, forcing a recognition of the other as a separate psychological entity. This recognition is the foundation of genuine respect, not the superficial respect of social politeness, but the deeper respect that acknowledges another's complete humanity. For men in relationship with women, this represents a profound psychological development, the ability to see beyond the anima projection to the actual woman before them. Dr. Robert Johnson, a Jungian analyst, wrote extensively about how romantic relationships often begin with projection, seeing in the other an idealized image that has more to do with our internal psychology than with the actual person. The woman who sets clear boundaries accelerates the dissolution of these projections, moving the relationship more quickly toward authenticity. This is why men who are psychologically mature find themselves respecting rather than resenting women who say no. The neuroscience behind this phenomenon is fascinating. When boundaries are violated, the brain's threat detection system activates, triggering fight or flight responses that make authentic connection impossible. Conversely, when boundaries are respected, the prefrontal cortex remains engaged, allowing for empathy, nuanced thinking, and genuine emotional connection. The woman who clearly communicates her boundaries creates the neurological conditions for respect to flourish. But the journey doesn't end with learning to say no. Jung's concept of individuation suggests that psychological development continues toward ever greater wholeness and integration. The next stage involves what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposing psychological realities without collapsing into one or the other. For the woman who has mastered no, this means developing an equally authentic yes. Not the people-pleasing yes of her earlier development, but a yes that emerges from genuine desire and alignment with her values. This integration creates a powerful psychological presence that commands respect, not through force but through authenticity. Rachel, a business owner from Chicago, described this evolution. Learning to say no was revolutionary for me, but I noticed something interesting as I got more comfortable with boundaries. My yeses became more powerful too. When I agree to something now, people know it's real, not just me trying to keep the peace. My enthusiasm is genuine, my commitment is solid, and people respond to that authenticity. The men in my life, colleagues, friends, my partner, seem to trust my yes precisely because they know I'm capable of saying no. Rachel's experience reflects Jung's understanding that psychological opposites need each other for completion. The authentic no makes possible the authentic yes, and together they form a more complete psychological wholeness. This wholeness manifests in what Jung called the self, not the ego self of everyday consciousness, but the larger self that encompasses both conscious and unconscious aspects of the personality. As individual women progress in their journey of psychological development, they increasingly embody this larger self, radiating an integrity that naturally elicits respect. The implications for male-female dynamics are profound. When both individuals in a relationship are engaged in their own individuation process, the relationship itself becomes a vehicle for mutual growth rather than mutual projection. The respect that flows between them is not based on social roles or power dynamics, but on recognition of each other's essential being. David, a professor from Austin, reflected on his 30-year marriage. In our early years, I was unconsciously drawn to my wife's strength, but I also tried to override her boundaries in 1,000 small ways. Looking back, I can see I was threatened by her separateness. It activated all my abandonment fears. The turning point came when she firmly stood her ground on an important decision, refusing to cave to my pressure. I was initially angry, then something shifted in me. I saw her, really saw her, as her own person on her own journey. That recognition transformed our relationship. The respect I feel for her now isn't about her accomplishments or what she does for me. It's about honoring her as a complete being, with her own inner compass. David's experience illustrates what Jung called the conjunctio, the alchemical marriage that occurs not just between two people, but between the masculine and feminine aspects within each person. As men develop their capacity to respect women's boundaries, they simultaneously develop their own anima, the feminine aspect of their psyche that Jung saw as essential to psychological wholeness. This internal development creates the conditions for relationships characterized by mutual respect rather than power struggles. The woman who says no catalyzes not just her own individuation, but potentially that of the men in her life as well. Consider how this dynamic plays out across different domains of life. In professional settings, research from Harvard Business School shows that women who clearly articulate boundaries and expectations are more likely to advance to leadership positions than those who adopt an exclusively accommodating stance. In family systems, therapists observe that healthier parent-child relationships form when mothers model appropriate boundary setting. In community organizations, women who balance contribution with clear limits often become the most influential members. These patterns reflect Jung's understanding that individuation is not a selfish process, but one that ultimately benefits the collective. As individual women become more psychologically whole, they contribute to a healthier collective psyche. The cultural implications are equally significant. For generations, American women have received mixed messages. Be desirable but not too sexual. Be successful but not threatening. Be strong but still nurturing. These contradictory expectations create what Jung would recognize as a psychological complex, an emotionally charged group of ideas that distorts perception and behavior. The simple act of saying no when it aligns with one's authentic self begins to dissolve this complex, freeing women to define themselves rather than being defined by cultural projections. As more women engage in this process of authentic boundary setting, cultural attitudes gradually shift. Men who might once have dismissed or resented female boundaries begin to recognize their value. The collective consciousness evolves toward greater respect for psychological sovereignty, not just between men and women, but across all human relationships. This evolution aligns with Jung's vision of human development. He believed that society advances not primarily through technological or economic progress, but through the psychological development of individuals. Each person who undertakes the journey toward wholeness contributes to the advancement of collective consciousness. For the woman reading or hearing these words, the implications are both empowering and challenging. The capacity to say no, to establish and maintain clear psychological boundaries, represents not just a personal skill, but a contribution to collective evolution. It requires courage to disappoint others, to risk disapproval, to stand firmly in one's truth when external pressures push toward accommodation. Yet the rewards of this courage extend beyond the respect it generates from others, particularly from men. The greater reward is internal, the growing sense of psychological integrity, the alignment between inner truth and outer expression, the profound self-respect that comes from honoring one's own boundaries. Jung wrote that, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you do not know, the world will tell you." The woman who has claimed her no has begun to answer this question for herself, rather than accepting the world's definitions. In doing so, she sets foot on the path of individuation, the lifelong journey toward becoming who she truly is, towards psychological wholeness. This journey transforms not just how men respect women, but how we all relate to one another as fully human beings, each on our own path of becoming, each worthy of the profound respect that comes from recognition of our essential being.